everyone. I am Christina with Burnley and Trowbridge, and thank you for joining us for part 2 of what is a 4-part sew-along where we are making an 18th century shirt. In this video, we are going to assemble the sleeve. So we'll be putting in the gusset, we'll be finishing the wristband, attaching that to the sleeve, and then we're also going to be preparing the collar or neckband of the shirt as well. To start with, let's grab our wristbands and the neckband or the collar because they are going to receive a very similar treatment in this next step. So preparing them at the same time might not only be a little bit of a time saver, but might help you get into a little bit of a rhythm. We'll go ahead and start with the wristband, but the process for the collar is going to be very similar. We want to fold the piece in half. And here you can finger press it, or you can take it to the ironing board if you wish. Once we're folded in half, we're going to go ahead and open that up. And on one side only at this point, we're going to fold back, say a fat 1/4 of an inch or so. And this is folding towards what will become the inside of the wristband or the collar. Do the same thing for your second wristband, and we'll repeat that for the collar as well. So folding it in half, opening it up. And for the collar, you can give a little more generous of a seam allowance. Feel free to turn that, say, closer to 3/8 of an inch, as you see here. Now that we have those folds pressed in, we are going to do some top stitching on these pieces along the fold. And I'll show you on one of the wristbands, but the process is exactly the same for the collar as well. And what we're going to be doing is a very small back stitch parallel to the fold. So it will actually hold the seam allowance back, and it will create a somewhat decorative stitch near the base of the wristband. On originals, these stitches are incredibly fine. They're usually very even and they're pretty small. So if you can, try to use your threads to gauge the size of your stitch, taking up, say, 2 to 3 threads per stitch if possible. If you can't get your stitches quite that small, that's okay. That's what practice is for. You can go ahead and watch our backstitch tutorial to practice, but by the time you have completed your shirt, you should see improvement in your stitching because you will be doing a lot of backstitching on this project. You want your stitches to be a scant 1/8 an inch or so away from the edge. And again, where possible, use your threads to help you not just count your stitches, but make sure that you are maintaining your stitching line parallel to the fold in the fabric. Try to pick a thread running along the grain or cross grain and stay stitching on that thread. If it helps, you could pull a thread here and stitch where you have pulled the thread, but it's not necessary to do so if you don't need to. Once you have stitched that first row of top stitching using that back stitch along the edge, you can stitch a second row on your wristbands if you would like. It's not required, but it is something that we do see on shirts in the 18th century. So that is an aesthetic option that you can choose or you can leave off. And before we complete the next step of top stitching, we are actually going to stitch the ends of our wristbands and collar. But before we close those edges, we want to first fold up the seam allowance on the edge opposite the edge that we stitched. This will become the interior of the wristband or the collar, but will not get back stitching or top stitching. Once that seam allowance is folded up, we have two approaches to close the ends of the wristband or the collar. The first approach is to flip the fold so that your piece is now right sides together, and you can back stitch along that edge and then turn your piece once you've back stitched it to open it up. Or, and this is the method that I'm going to use right now, you can fold in the seam allowance on the short edge like you see here. Go ahead and finger press that pretty nicely. You could press it with the iron if you wish. Once that is folded and all of the seam allowances are turned to the inside, we can stitch from the exterior or the right side by treating it as a butted whipped seam. And just take tiny little stitches on the very edge of the fold. And if you have not used this technique before, we do have a tutorial for it that is linked in the description below, so check that out. Keep your edges nice and even and aligned. And go ahead and repeat for the other side. And you will want to do this for both of your wristbands and your collar. Once we have closed those ends to create our wristband and our collar, we are actually going to do another row of top stitching using a back stitch, only this time instead of stitching back that fold at the part of the wristband that will actually connect to the sleeve, we're going to be stitching along the fold that will actually rest towards the hand. While it's decorative, it certainly looks attractive. This stitching serves a purpose as well, because if we were to leave that folded edge at the loose end of the wristband unstitched, when this is laundered, it would be very easy for that wristband to fold over on itself and not maintain the edge in the appropriate spot. So, by putting a row of top stitching along that fold, we're actually going to secure that fold in place and keep everything lying nice and flat on that wristband and also on the collar. Again, for this stitching, we're going to be stitching about 1/8 of an inch or so away from the edge. So it's going to be somewhat close to the edge, and we want to stitch that back stitching parallel to that folded edge, staying on the same thread the whole way. Again, these stitches are fairly small, so we're picking up, say, 2 or 3 threads per stitch if you can manage. Otherwise, do your best. We're going to go ahead and do this again for both of our wristbands and our collar. So get those stitched up and then we'll come back here. Grab our sleeve and our sleeve gusset and let's assemble the body of our sleeve. Now in our shift video, I gave you one approach to assembling a sleeve, and you can certainly watch that video and use that same approach here. The big difference being when you seam up the sleeve, you need to leave about a 2 to 2.5 inch opening near the edge that will join to the wristband, because we need to make sure that when we attach the wristband that the sleeve can open when the wristband is unbuttoned to allow the hand to pass through and then be buttoned again. So first thing that we will do is take the sleeve body, make sure you're working on the correct edge. So make sure you're working on the side that is meant to be the length of the sleeve and not the width of the sleeve. Take your gusset and offset the gusset ever so slightly, as you see there. And then we are going to backstitch this together using about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. One note on when you start your stitching: if you are starting near the fuller part of the sleeve, you do want to leave about a 1/4 inch loose at the bottom here. So leave just a little bit where you don't stitch, because we're going to need that in just a moment when we seam up the rest of our sleeve. So start seaming from the bottom of the gusset about a 1/4 inch up, and then give yourself a 1/4 inch seam allowance with the offset seam. So right now, this is what it looks like. Take the gusset, fold it over to make it a triangle, and match it up just like that to the side seam of the sleeve. Give yourself a little bit of an offset there as well, and we'll pin that in place. And then when it meets at the point of the gusset, we will fold that over and continue that little bit of an offset down the sleeve as we pin down the sleeve. Remembering to leave that little bit open at the bottom edge for the wristband. So I'll run a pin the opposite way there, just to let me know that that is where I want to stop stitching. So now what we will do is we will stitch from the gusset to the point, and then flip that over and stitch from the point down to the sleeve to the point that we marked for our wristband slits. And we'll backstitch this first. Once you have backstitched, you still have those open ends that your wristband is going to attach to. So let's deal with those first. And we want to fold these back and hem them. So if we start with the edge that was offset, that will be quite easy. Just take 2 small folds, and that will roll right into our felled seam when we get there. So you can see that is now ready to be hemmed. And from the exterior, it will have been turned to the inside. And then if we flip over, now we'll deal with the other edge, which we also want to roll towards the inside of the garment. So for this one, we will also take 2 small folds. We want to make sure that as we get into the area where we'll be seaming, that we ease that hem out to a very, very small fold that goes into the seam. And that's because when we fell this area and we turn this over to fold it underneath to fell the seam, we want to make sure that we enclose all of those raw edges. And so by hemming this, grading it out, when we open this up and we turn to fell, it'll close all of that up nice and neatly with no raw edges peeking out. So you want to hem those openings just as I showed you there. And then when we get ready to fill the seam, we want to first fold under the side of the sleeve that we set back a little bit from the edge. And we want to turn over the gusset on that side first. And you can stitch that. I'm going to just pin it so that I can show you how to fold the next part. Once that is secure, we will take our long edge that's left. We will fold over starting at the gusset. And then when you get to that peak, you can just neatly fold at the point like you see there. And secure that. And that makes sure that all of those raw edges are tucked in and covered up. And then simply work your way down the rest of the sleeve. Turning over that seam, and when you hit those slits, they should already be hemmed, and you can turn those under to make sure that all of the raw edges are enclosed. Once you've turned that seam, we're going to go ahead and fell that down, and then when we come back, we will get ready to put on our wristbands. Once we have seamed up our sleeves, so we've put the gusset in, we've seamed up to the bottom, but we've left that little bit open at the area of the sleeve that will connect to the wristband. We need to gather up the sleeve to get ready to attach our wristband. To do that, we are going to use a method that you have seen us use many, many times when we need to gather something down. We are going to mark some divisions by folding our sleeve. We're going to mark half, then we're going to fold again to mark quarters. And then just as we did in our shift sleeve hack, where we ran those rows of gathering stitches, we are going to do the same thing here on our shirt. And if you're working with a check, this can be really easy because you can follow the lines of your check and pick up a few threads, basically doing a very small running stitch to draw up in gathers. And I like to actually do this with 4 sets of threads so that I can adjust my gathers within each section. You can do it all in one if you'd like. You can use 2 sets of gathering threads, but what I'm going to do is actually run my gathering threads from the edge to my first pin that marks my first quarter, and then I will actually anchor them off to that pin, and then I will overlap just ever so slightly my next set of gathering threads, run them to the next pin, and anchor those off on that pin as well. And this will make it a little bit easier when we go to put that wristband on and we match this up with the quarters on our wristband. We are going to now attach our sleeve to the wristband. And if you want to see this in more detail, a little bit slower, we do have a tutorial that we will link below that focuses just on setting a wristband, so setting a sleeve to a wristband. So I'm going to go through it here, but you can click on that tutorial for a more detailed step-by-step walkthrough on that process. Since we have already quartered our sleeve, we need to now also quarter our wristband. So let's go ahead and fold our wristband in half. Mark our halfway point. And then mark our quarter points as well. I'm just using a pin. You could use some different colored tag threads here to just mark those spots, whatever is convenient for you. Once you have marked your wristband into quarters, then we can take our sleeve and match it to our wristband. Do be careful at this point that you pay attention to what is supposed to be the outside of your sleeve or the right side of your sleeve, and make sure that you are matching that to the right side of your wristband. I will match my ends, and then I will start to draw down my gathers. So I need to draw down this segment to fit inside of this segment. Once I've drawn down my segment, I'm going to go ahead and knot off my gathering thread for that segment on the other end so that it's nice and secure to that length. And to start my next segment of gathering, I'm going to do the same thing that I just did. I will take the ends that overlapped with my first segment, and now I'll gather down this segment as well. And we're going to do this for all of the segments of the sleeve, gathering them down to their appropriate segment in the wristband. When you gather down the last section of the sleeve, I like to actually leave that end unanchored on the very tail, because if there is any adjustment that we have to do that's like a minor adjustment to get the sleeve to fit into the cuff, we'll go ahead and take that up in that last section. I have gathered down my sleeve. And now that it's gathered, we are going to apply the cuff by opening the cuff and inserting our sleeve gathers in between the two layers of the cuff. Now, if you're a person that likes to put your gathers on either side of the edge you're going to stitch and then pull that top layer out, you're welcome to do that. Let's go ahead and get our wristband on. And this is just going to be loosely getting everything pinned together. This doesn't have to be anything perfect at this point. We're going to talk about what to do with those gathers as we stitch them down in just a moment. For now, we just want to make sure that our length looks correct and that our gathers are relatively even. So as we come to the end of the wristband, what I like to do is go ahead and anchor that edge. Just about spot on this one. So what I will do is pin my wristband into place. And just put an extra anchor pin at the end. I'm still not gonna tie off my gathers yet because as we stitch, things might shift or stretch a little bit. So I still wanna have that little bit of wiggle room that this will give me. But for the most part, we are looking pretty good right now. When it comes to stitching the wristband on, we are going to whip the wristband onto the sleeve, catching the peak of each gather on the edge of the fold of the wristband, the part that's been turned back, and we've done that top stitching on. But before we do that, we actually want to make sure that all of our gathers are laying quite nicely. When we see originals, we see some very fine, even, small gathering in this area of the garment, and so we want to replicate that when possible. One way that you can do this is by taking a pin or a needle and just very carefully arranging the gathers, just like you see there, so that where they connect to the wristband, they lay nicely stacked next to each other. And this is a technique that some people refer to as stroke gathers or stroking the gathers, and that's a perfectly acceptable later term for this technique. It doesn't appear that this terminology is used in the 18th century. It is not something that we see in any textual evidence until really into the 19th century. But just be aware, like many other stitches that have names that have evolved, we don't necessarily believe that this is what this technique is being called prior to the 19th century, but it is a name that does appear in the 19th century. And it's certainly a technique or concept that's being applied in the 18th century of neatly stacking those gathers next to one another. And this part can be quite tedious, so you might spend a little bit of time on it, and that's okay. There you can see what my gathers look like after they have been kind of neatly stacked. So it does make a difference, and I do recommend that you try to do this before whipping on your wristband. I actually prefer to do this as I work along my wristband, applying the wristband. I don't like to do this all ahead of time because things can get messed up as you're sewing. So I will lay my gathers for a short segment, stitch those down, and then lay the next batch of gathers, stitch those down. You can do it however you prefer. Just do be aware that as you're manipulating the garment, before those gathers get stitched, they might wiggle around on you. Even if you've already laid in your gathers pretty neatly, you can see that as I'm stitching, my gathers are still shifting a little bit, and I still need to maybe manipulate them before I stitch them down. So feel free to use your needle to help you with that process. To find the peak of the gather and secure it. Now, the trick is we're going to do this the whole way around the front of our wristband. And then once that is secure, we are going to reverse on the back side of the wristband, as you see here. And we are going to do exactly the same thing on the back side. So we will catch the peak of each gather and catch just the edge of the fold on the back side of the wristband, and we'll stitch that the whole way around as well. So let's go ahead and finish attaching our wristband. All right, so you can see our wristband that has been whipped down, catching the peaks of each of our gathers that we have laid gently together. The next thing that we are going to do is actually then turn our wristband to the interior, and we're going to do the same thing on the inside. We're going to catch the peak of the gather, catch the edge of the fold of the wristband, and whip that down the whole way. And there we have our wristband attached to our sleeve. If you haven't already put your buttonholes in your wristband, now is a pretty good time to do that before we attach the sleeves to the body later on. Now, the way that you deal with the buttons on your wristband could vary. It is certainly common to see sleeve buttons being used on men's shirts. If you do not have sleeve buttons, you could always put your two buttonholes in and run a string through them to tie it at the wrist. Uh, but sleeve buttons do seem to be the most typical way of fastening this closure. Your sleeve buttons might vary in size, and so instead of running through what size to make this cut and covering all of those things, I'm just going to recommend that you watch our buttonhole tutorial on YouTube. We'll have the link in the description below, and that will give you all of the information that you need to put your buttonholes in your wristbands for your shirt sleeves. Once both of your sleeves are assembled, your wristbands are attached, your buttonholes are in, and your neckband is prepared, then you are done with part 2 and you are ready to move on to part 3, which will be coming at you soon. Friends, thank you for joining us for part 2 of our tutorial. We hope that your shirts are well underway. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe so that you are notified when part 3 comes out. Until then, happy stitching!